He was one of the most feared men on 2 continents. Kang Min-jun, Korean Mafia boss. 11 years of running an empire built on silence and fear. The kind of man who walked into rooms and watched everyone in them recalculate. The kind of man who wore a watch worth more than most people's cars and sat at tables where hesitation was a death sentence. And on one night, all of it meant nothing. Because the woman he was going to marry, the woman he had chosen a ring for, made plans with, allowed himself, for the first time in his life, to trust, had just poisoned him. She poured the wine herself. She looked him in the eyes while he drank it. And when he finally felt it, that bitter edge at the back of the third sip, she didn't run. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with those flat, beautiful eyes and said the name of the faction that had sent her, and waited for him to fall. He made it 4 blocks, then the alley, the wall, the wet concrete. 11 years of power dissolving into a man alone at 2 a.m. with no one to call and no way to admit he was dying. And that's when she appeared. Not one of his men, not a doctor on his payroll. A black nurse, walking home from the night shift, tired, carrying a worn canvas bag. Every reason in the world to keep walking. She stopped. She knelt down beside the most dangerous man she had ever seen, and she saved his life. Asking nothing, expecting nothing, knowing exactly who he was, and doing it anyway. What happened next changed them both in ways neither of them saw coming. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a member and help our channel. There are men the world builds specifically to be unmoved. Kang Min-jun was one of them. Not born that way, no one is, but sculpted, deliberately and over time, the way a river carves stone. Not quickly, not with drama, just with pressure and patience, and the slow erasure of every soft thing until only the hard remains. He had been running the Kang Syndicate for 11 years by the time that evening arrived. 11 years of sitting at the head of tables where silence meant obedience, and hesitation meant weakness. 11 years of knowing exactly what his name did to a room when it entered before he did. In Seoul, in Tokyo, in the back corridors of Chicago's Koreatown, the name landed like a dropped object. Something heavy, something you stepped around. His men would have said he felt nothing. They would have been wrong. He felt everything. He had simply learned, very early, that showing it was a transaction he could not afford. Cheon had entered his life 3 years before the night in question, through a charity gala he attended only to be seen attending. She was precise. That was the first thing he noticed. Not her beauty, which was considerable, but the precision of it. The way she moved through a room as though she had already mapped every exit. He recognized it because he did the same thing. He thought it was compatibility. It was, in fact, recognition of a shared training he did not know they both had. He proposed 7 months before she killed him. Or tried to. The dinner was at a restaurant he owned under a subsidiary 3 shells removed from anything with his name on it. Quiet. Private. The kind of place where the staff understood that forgetting what they had seen was part of the service. Cheon had worn a navy dress with a faint shimmer at the hem, pearl earrings he had given her on the occasion of their first anniversary. She had been warm, attentive. She had poured the wine herself, which she rarely did. He noticed the bitterness at the back of the third sip, but assigned it to the vintage. A man who has survived this long develops instincts that work faster than thought. But that night, His instincts were a fraction of a second too slow. By the time the wrongness registered fully, she was already looking at him with those flat, beautiful eyes. And she said it with the kind of calm that is only possible when a decision has been made so far in advance that the emotional weight of it has already been spent. "The Shin faction," she said, "sends their regards." He did not move. He had learned never to move when something hit him. Not because he was unaffected, but because stillness was the only weapon left when everything else had been taken. He looked at her for a long moment, filing every detail of her face as it was in that instant. The tiniest tension at the corner of her mouth that told him she had not wanted this, though she had done it. And then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. He made it 4 blocks. Then the alley, and the wall, and the wet concrete under his hands, and the sound of his own breathing coming slower than it should. His phone was in his hand. The doctor's number, the only one who could help, rang without answer. His second-in-command would ask questions he could not afford to answer. His enemies would interpret a call to anyone as vulnerability. He had built, over 11 years, an impenetrable architecture of protection. And now, in the only moment that mattered, he was alone inside it. He pressed his back against the bricks. Above him, Chicago's sky was the color of old bruises, sodium orange against the clouds. He had never paid attention to the sky before. He was paying attention now. He was still paying attention when the footsteps came. 11:18. There are sounds a person makes when they are trying not to be heard suffering. Min-jun had heard them before, in interrogation rooms, in hospital waiting areas outside doors he had put people behind. He knew the specific quality of restrained pain, the way it compresses itself into shallow breathing and careful stillness. He had never expected to be the one making those sounds. He was making them now, and he could not stop. And that fact alone was more frightening than the poison moving through him. He did not hear her approach so much as become aware of her presence, a shift in the air, footsteps that paused where they should have continued. Most people, when they see a man like him in a situation like that, perform a rapid and entirely rational calculation. They find somewhere else to be. The city at 2 in the morning is full of reasons to look away, and anyone with sense uses every one of them. She did not look away. He became aware of her the way you become aware of light when you have been in the dark a long time. Not all at once, but gradually, and then completely. She was tall, and the single working streetlight caught the edges of her face as she crouched down to his level. Unhurried, the way someone moves when they have already decided what they are going to do, and are no longer deliberating. Her nurse's badge caught the light. He clocked it the way he clocked everything, automatically, without deciding to. She did not ask what happened. She did not ask his name. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck with a matter-of-factness that suggested she had done this 1,000 times in worse places. And she counted something silently, and her expression did not change in the way expressions change when people are afraid. It changed in the way expressions change when someone is thinking very fast and very clearly. "You're going to look at me," she said. Not a question, a parameter. "What did you take? Or what were you given?" He looked at her. In 11 years of commanding rooms, he had never been spoken to like that. Not with aggression, not with fear, but with a kind of brisk authority that assumed compliance because compliance was the only sensible response. He found, to his own distant surprise, that he complied. "Wine," he said. "Something in the wine." She nodded once, already moving. She had a bag over one shoulder. Not a medical bag, a regular bag. a worn canvas thing with a transit card clipped to the strap, and she was opening it with one hand while her other hand remained on his wrist. He noticed the bracelet. Leather. Thin. The kind of thing you keep because of what it meant, not what it's worth. "I need you to stand," she said. "I know you don't want to. Stand anyway." He stood. He did not know why he obeyed a woman he had never seen in his life, in an alley, at 2 a.m, while his empire slept 3 miles away, unaware that its center was coming apart. He stood because she told him to, and because there was something in her voice that made this obedience feel not dangerous, but simply beside the point, like arguing with gravity. She took his weight without comment. She was stronger than she looked. Or perhaps she had simply learned, the way nurses learn, how to use structure rather than strength. They moved in silence for 5 blocks. He focused on each step as its own complete problem. She focused on him, peripherally, constantly, the way someone watches a patient, not with emotion, but with attention, which is its own form of care. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had once been something grander and had settled, over decades, into a dignified smallness. She got him to the couch. She took his jacket off with the same brisk efficiency. She found the vein in the crook of his elbow with a needle from her bag, and did something that began, slowly, to push the cold out of his hands. He watched her work. There was a photograph on the wall directly in his line of sight. A woman in her 60s with a wide smile and reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead. Beside it, a child of about 7 in a school uniform, gap-toothed, delighted. And beside that, a boy of about 16 or 17, thin-shouldered, wearing a basketball jersey, his eyes shaped exactly like the woman moving around the room. Min-jun looked at that boy for a long time. He knew that face. Not specifically. He had never seen this particular boy before. But he knew the category of that face. He had seen it in the periphery of his operations for years. Young men caught in the particular geography of neighborhoods where his industry and their lives shared the same streets. He had not thought about those faces. He had thought about shipments and loyalty and the geometry of power. The faces had been background. He thought about it now. He couldn't stop. "You know what I am," he said. It was not a question. It was barely even a statement. It was the closest thing to confession he had ever produced. She was checking his pulse again, not looking at him directly. "I know what you do," she said. There was a pause, precise and deliberate, a pause that contained more than silence does. "That's not the same thing." She said it without anger. Without forgiveness, either. She was not offering him absolution, was not interested in performing mercy for his benefit. She said it the way someone states a distinction that matters to them privately, that they are not asking him to understand, but that they are also not willing to leave unstated. He did not respond. Outside, Chicago continued its night. Somewhere in the city, Cheon was in a car heading toward an airport. Somewhere, men with the Shin faction's money in their pockets were checking their phones for confirmation of a death that had not arrived. Somewhere, his second-in-command was sleeping with a phone on the pillow beside him, waiting for a call that Min-jun had decided, in this small, bright room with its photographs and its leather bracelet and its smell of antiseptic and something cooking earlier in the evening, not to make yet. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 11 years, he was somewhere that nothing was required of him. He did not know what to do with that. He stayed very still and let it be true, and did not move until morning. 11:20. He woke to light he did not recognize, That was the first thing, the quality of it, coming through curtains that were neither blackout nor sheer, but somewhere in between. The kind of curtains that belonged to someone who chose them for comfort rather than function. The light was ordinary, domestic. It fell across the floor in a rectangle and moved slightly as the curtains breathed with the ventilation. And Min-jun lay still and watched it for a full minute before he remembered where he was and how he had arrived there. The second thing he noticed was that he was still alive. He took inventory the way he always did upon waking, a habit built over years of sleeping in places where the geometry of survival required immediate assessment. Pulse, present, steadier than it had any right to be. Pain, a deep, dull ache across the left side of his abdomen, the kind that speaks of a body that has fought something and won narrowly. Hands, responsive. The needle mark in the crook of his elbow was covered with a small piece of medical tape, applied with the same neat efficiency as everything else she had done. He sat up slowly. The apartment was quiet in the particular way of early morning. Not empty quiet, but occupied quiet. The kind that has someone in it who is simply elsewhere in the space. He could hear water running behind a closed door. He looked at the photographs again, in the daylight this time, and the boy's face looked back at him with the same gap-toothed openness it had at 2 a.m, indifferent to what it made him feel. His phone had 11 missed calls. He silenced it without looking at the names. Not yet. He sat with the silence and the light and the mild bewilderment of being a man who had survived the night through no mechanism he had constructed for himself, through no loyalty he had purchased or fear he had installed in someone else. He was alive because a woman he had never met had been walking home at the right moment and had made a choice that cost her sleep and resources and, potentially, depending on who had been watching that alley, considerably more. He was still holding the phone when she came out of the back room. She had changed into clothes for the day, simple, unhurried. She looked at him the way a nurse looks at a patient upon morning rounds, assessing, noting, moving on. Pulse, she said, and reached for his wrist before he could respond, which he realized was her established method, not asking permission for the clinical things, because permission was beside the point when the alternative was someone dying on your couch. She counted, nodded. Better, she said. You need to eat something before you go anywhere. You won't make it 2 blocks otherwise. He watched her move to the small kitchen. She did not ask him what he wanted. She produced eggs and toast and a glass of water with 2 tablets she identified without being asked as activated charcoal follow-up, and she set it in front of him with the same unornamented efficiency she applied to everything. He ate. He could not remember the last time he had eaten something he had not ordered from a restaurant staffed by people who had been vetted by his security team. The eggs were plain and slightly oversalted, and they were the most uncomplicated thing he had consumed in a decade. Why? He said when he was halfway through. She was standing at the counter with her own coffee, looking out the window at the street below. She did not pretend not to understand the question. Because you were there and you needed help, she said. That's all it was. That's not all it was, he said. You knew enough to know what I was. You knew enough to know what happens to people who help men like me when the wrong people find out about it. She turned from the window then and looked at him directly for the first time in the full light, and he saw something in her face that he recognized with a precision that surprised him. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because he had not expected to see it here, on her, in this context. It was the expression of someone who has already done the calculation he was describing, who had done it in the alley before she crouched down, and had arrived at a number that did not change the outcome. I know what it costs, she said quietly. I've been paying that kind of cost since I was 17. She did not explain further. She did not need to. He looked at the photograph on the wall, the boy in the basketball jersey, and something locked into place in his understanding. With a click he felt rather than heard. And he did not ask the question that was forming because some questions are answered more completely by silence than by words. And he had learned, in 11 years of reading rooms, when to let a silence be what it was. He finished the eggs. He drank the water. He looked at his phone. 14 missed calls now. His second in command, 2 underbosses, a number he didn't recognize that had the area code of a Seoul district he associated specifically with the Shin faction, which told him the confirmation they had been waiting for had not arrived, and they were beginning to wonder why. He needed to move. He needed to re-enter the world he had built and deal with what Ji-yun had set in motion. And he needed to do it before the uncertainty in his organization metastasized into something that would take months to correct. He knew all of this. He understood the calculus perfectly. He sat for another moment anyway. "There's an envelope," he said finally. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, which she had folded over the arm of the couch with the care you give to something that doesn't belong to you. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. "No," she said. Simple. Unambiguous. Not offended. She had clearly anticipated this possibility and had already resolved it before it arrived. "It's not payment," he said. "I don't—" He stopped. He was not accustomed to explaining himself. He was finding, in this small apartment with its ordinary light, that the language he had built for the world outside did not work in here. "I don't have another way to—" "I know," she said. And she did. He could see that she did. She understood that this was the only vocabulary he had for gratitude, that the envelope was the closest his particular life had come to teaching him how to say thank you. She understood it, and she was declining it anyway, not with contempt, but with a completeness that made the refusal feel like its own kind of gift. "Keep it," she said. "Go do what you need to do." He stood. He put his jacket on. He looked at the boy in the photograph one more time, and then he looked at her, and he held that for a moment. This woman who had every reason, structural and personal and historical, to have kept walking, and had not. And he said nothing, because there was nothing in his vocabulary adequate to what he wanted to say. And he left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. She stood in the quiet of her apartment and looked at the envelope he had left on the table despite her refusal. And after a long moment, she picked up her coffee and went back to the window and watched the street below until she saw him emerge from the building entrance, cross the sidewalk, and disappear around the corner without looking back. She did not open the envelope that day, or the next. 11:22. Some debts cannot be settled. That is not a weakness in the accounting. It is a property of the thing itself. Min-jun understood debt better than most men alive. He had built an empire on its architecture, the precise calibration of what was owed and to whom, the interest that accumulated on loyalty unpaid, the compound weight of favors that had no expiration date. He understood that debt was not really about money, had never been about money, was always and only about power. The power of the person who was owed over the person who owed. He had positioned himself with great deliberate care over 11 years, always on the side of the owed. For the first time in those 11 years, he was on the other side. He did not know what to do with that. He walked back into his world and he did what was required, made the calls, steadied the organization, sent the message to the Shin faction that their attempt had failed and that the consequences of failure were now being calculated, sent the message quietly and through the appropriate channels so that it arrived with the weight he intended. His men saw nothing unusual in his face or his manner. He had trained them to read him, and he had trained himself simultaneously and for exactly this reason, to show nothing that he did not choose to show. But in the private hours, in the car between meetings, in the elevator, in the 4 minutes before sleep arrived each night, he returned to the apartment, to the ordinary light, to the eggs, to the specific quality of being in a space where nothing was required of him and no one needed him to be the thing he had made himself into. He returned, most often, to the boy in the photograph. He made inquiries. Not through his usual channels. He was careful about that. Careful that the inquiry not become a transaction, not become the thing she had refused when she refused the envelope. He found what he needed to find through means that left no trace back to her door. The boy's name had been Marcus. He had been 19. The bullet had not been meant for him. That category of tragedy so common it had its own unofficial taxonomy in the neighborhoods where his organization operated, the ones that appeared in the ledger as geography rather than consequence. He sat with that for a long time. He had never, in 11 years, sat with consequence. He had managed it, neutralized it, redirected it, but sitting with it, allowing it to simply be what it was and to cost what it cost, was not a skill he had developed, because it was not a skill that his world rewarded. His world rewarded the ability to move forward. To move forward, you had to stop looking back. He had stopped looking back so completely and for so long that he had forgotten there was anything there. Destiny had not forgotten. She carried it in a leather bracelet on her left wrist, and she carried it into alleys at 2 a.m, and she carried it into the decision to help a man whose industry had authored the very loss she wore on her wrist. And she had not let it make her into something smaller. She had let it make her into someone who stopped. He did not have a language for what that was. He understood intellectually that it had a name, that people in other kinds of lives called it grace, or mercy, or simply decency. But those words had been theoretical for so long that they had lost the texture of real things. She had given them texture back. She had done it without intending to, without asking anything in return, which was precisely why it worked. Every lesson he had ever been given had come attached to an agenda. This one arrived clean. It took him 6 weeks. The hospital received the donation through a foundation so thoroughly anonymized that 3 forensic accountants working in concert could not have traced it back to him. The equipment was specific. The exact models his quiet research had identified as most needed in that particular emergency department, on that particular night shift, by those particular nurses working with what they had. The renovation was done over a weekend while the department was at reduced capacity, coordinated with the hospital administration through intermediaries who knew only that a private donor wished to remain private. The plaque was his own addition. Small, brushed steel, placed at the entrance to the corridor where she would pass it at the start of every shift. In memory of Marcus Reaves. Nothing else. No foundation name, no donor acknowledgement. Just the name, given back to the wall of a place that had nothing to do with how Marcus had died, and everything to do with how his sister had chosen to live after. He was not there when she found it. He would never know exactly what her face did in that moment, whether she cried or simply stood very still, the way she had stood at the window watching him leave, whether she touched the letters or kept her hands at her sides. He did not need to know. The not knowing was part of the intention. She had given him something without making it about herself, without requiring his witness, and he understood now that the correct response was symmetrical. You give back in the same register in which you received. Ji-yeon he found in Busan, in a hotel overlooking the water, 6 weeks after that. He went alone. He had not gone alone to anything in a decade. His second-in-command had argued against it with a persistence that bordered on insubordination, and Min-jun had let him argue and had gone alone anyway. Because what he needed to do in that room was not something that could be done with witnesses. She was sitting at the window when he arrived, which told him she had known he was coming. She had always been better at intelligence than she let people see, which was, he understood now, entirely the point of her. She looked at him with those flat, beautiful eyes, and she did not perform surprise or fear. And he found that he respected that even now, perhaps especially now. He sat across from her. Outside, the sea moved with the slow indifference of things that have been doing what they do for longer than human drama has existed to observe them. He did not ask her why. He knew why. The Shin faction had recruited her before he met her, had placed her with the precision of people who understood that the way to a careful man was not through his security, but through the single opening he had left in it, the human one. The one that wanted to be known by someone, to be chosen. They had found that opening, and they had built her to fit it, and they had been patient, as he had been patient in his own operations, and the patience had very nearly worked. What he asked her instead was something that surprised them both. Did any of it? He stopped, looked at the sea, looked back. Was there any part of it that was real? She held his gaze for a long moment, long enough that he understood she was not constructing an answer, but locating one, reaching past the training and the mission and the 3 years of sustained performance to find what was actually underneath. Yes, she said. And then, because she had always been precise, that was the problem. He nodded. He sat with that, the way he had been learning to sit with things, the way that cost something but produced, in the end, a different kind of knowing than the kind he was used to. He left her alive. He walked out of that hotel room and he left her with her life intact. And he did not explain the decision to his organization. And his organization, which had expected something irrevocable, received his silence on the subject with the unease of people who understand that they are witnessing something they lack the framework to interpret. They were right. They did lack the framework. He had gotten it 6 weeks earlier, in an alley, from a woman who asked nothing. The Shin faction received a message 3 days later, delivered through channels too precise to be misunderstood, that the matter was considered closed. Not forgiven, not forgotten. Closed, which in his language meant, we are moving forward, but I have recorded everything, and the ledger is open, and you will spend the rest of your operational lives knowing that I know, and wondering when I will decide that closed is no longer the right word. It was, his second-in-command noted privately, the most controlled and therefore the most frightening response Min-jun had ever given to an existential threat. His second-in-command was not wrong, but he was also not entirely right, because control was not what had produced that response. Something else had, something quieter and harder to name, something that had arrived in the form of a stranger who knelt in an alley and pressed 2 fingers to the neck of a man the world had built to be unmoved, and treated the pulse she found there as worth saving. He had been running his empire for 11 years when that night happened. He ran it differently after. Not visibly. Not in ways his enemies could identify or his allies could quantify. But in the private hours, in the car between meetings, in the 4 minutes before sleep. He thought about what it meant to be in a position of absolute power and to use it, just once, just in one small, deliberate way, to put a name back on a wall. He thought about what it meant that it was the thing he was most proud of. He had never been proud of anything before. He was not sure what to do with that either. But he was learning, slowly, in the way that men learn things when they have spent a lifetime being taught only what was useful, and are encountering, for the first time, something that is simply true. He was learning to let it be there, to sit with it, to not move forward until he had looked at it fully. Outside, in cities on 2 continents, his name still landed like a dropped object when it entered a room before he did. Heavy, something you stepped around. But in a hospital corridor in Chicago, on a brushed steel plaque that caught the morning light at the start of every shift, a different name held the wall. That one he had put there freely. That one no one had made him do. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever helped someone who the world had already written off? Not because they deserved it, not because you owed them anything, but simply because they were there and they needed it. And have you ever been the person who was written off? Judged by your reputation, your appearance, your past, and saved anyway by someone who chose to see past all of it? Destiny didn't save Min-jun because he was good. She saved him because she refused to let what he was decide what she would do. And he didn't honor Marcus because it made him look better. He did it because, for the first time in 11 years, he had learned what it felt like to receive something freely, and he wanted to give that back. That is the rarest thing in the world, and it lives in the smallest decisions. Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about grace, redemption, and the quiet power of human decency, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.